My name is Richard Ferrer, and I can say I am cloud hired.
That yes, come and join and get cloud hired. I'm cloud hired.
I'm cloud hired.
I'm cloud hired.
Hey, Go Cloud Architect family. I'm cloud hired.
Well, I'm cloud hired, guys.
So I'll just say I'm cloud hired.
I'm cloud hired.
I'm cloud hired thanks to Go Cloud Architects.
It worked for me, and now I'm cloud hired. Because of Google Architect program, I am cloud hired. See!
I am cloud hired. Thank you, Mike and the Go Cloud team.
Welcome, everyone. This is Mike Gibbs, and we are here to answer any kind of security architect career questions you may have. And I understand there's things going on with an AWS outage today, and if you have questions related to multi-cloud architecture as well, I am more than happy to address them. We've talked for years about why single cloud architectures are dangerous for large-scale enterprises and why we've always trained hybrid and multi-cloud architects. So if you've got questions about that, please feel free to address that as well. Not necessarily the specifics of AWS, but why organizations do things differently for high availability and high performance systems than they would do in, say, a solutions architect boot camp, but real world versus, training. So I'm here to address any of those questions you want. So prior to answering any questions, I want to let you know about some free things that we have going on. Tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern, we have a boot camp on how to become an enterprise architect. We're going to talk about the enterprise architect role, which is one of my favorite roles that I've maintained for a couple of decades now. We're going to talk about the skills you need for an enterprise architect, and if you've got questions about any other architecture career, like a security architect, I'm happy to address them. We're going to talk about the skills you need. We're going to talk about how you can get hired. We'll make sure you understand the major differences between what people think architecture is versus what architecture really is, so you can build a career. And it'll be live and free on Zoom, so ask me any kind of enterprise architect career questions you want, and I'll do anything I can to assist you. I also wanted to let everybody know that we are doing a free cybersecurity essentials boot camp, and it's going to start on Thursday. We're going to have 5 weeks live and free on Zoom, and because it's on Zoom, you'll be able to answer questions, and it's all free, hosted by Go Cloud Careers. So come join us. It's fun and it is free, and we've increased our fall savings. We have a new program for 50% off for at least the near future. We're going to be at 50% off. So if you've been waiting to take advantage of a sale at our organization, take advantage of it now. So I'm here because I remember starting my technology career. I remember when I left internal medicine, and I remember as I was a nurse practitioner with an internal medicine office moving into tech, and I got all kinds of bad advice. I learned things that were completely unrelated to the job, and it cost me a lot of time, a lot of effort and money. And then I got great advice, got my first job a few months later, moved into a principal solutions architect role 2 years later, and a few years after that, I had moved into executive roles, enterprise architect and above. And this is great, and I love all these roles. So ask questions so I can help. Don't get stuck. Don't go listen to someone that was an intern that got removed from their internship and now is trying to guide you. They don't know. Or someone that can't get a job or hasn't had the job. So ask me any questions you desire. Chris, bring in the first question. From Denver. Hello, Mike. What's the balance between hands-on technical work and strategic planning in the security architect role? Denver, there is absolutely zero hands-on work in any security architect role. So you won't be configuring a firewall. You won't be configuring a SIEM system. You won't be configuring an IDS IPS system. There is zero role in any architect role. So let's take the security architect role itself. What is it you're really going to do? You're going to be meeting with the executives of that organization. You're going to be learning what the executives need, where they are actually going. And why do you have to start with the executives to figure out where the business is going? Well, security can block the business from going where it needs to. So you really need to understand that, the organization. Then you need to understand how people do their jobs at the organization and what's important to the organization. So that's going to be about 3 months of conversations where you're going to be communicating with stakeholders. You're going to be looking at key business processes, how a sales rep does their job. Because if we're going to add security, we can't stop that sales rep from doing their job. How is support created? Because we need to understand how everybody knows their job. So then we can figure out how to create the maximum level of security, keep people limited to the least level of privilege they need, and actually create an architecture that's going to work. So understand that. So that's going to be months of conversations just to get that. Now, next, what we need to do is really need to look at that organization, and we need to determine what their assets are. We need to catalog their assets, catalog what their critical systems are. We need to quantify the value of their assets with them, so we know what we're protecting, because we're not going to design a system that's going to cost $100 billion if we're protecting a $10 thing. Now, we might spend $100 billion on security if we're protecting a $3 trillion thing. We might, depending upon the risk to that asset. So we need to know what we're protecting. We need to then learn the organization's risk tolerance and risk appetite. And then we need to prioritize what risks we have inside of that organization. So we can't get to a perfectly zero risk environment. There's no such thing as purely safe. So what we need to do is look at the risks, quantify the risks based upon the system, weaknesses in the system, and the assets we have, determine which risk we're going to fix first. Mitigate. So we can mitigate these two things with, say, a administrative control. We could mitigate these things with a technical control, like a next generation firewall, what have you. So we're going to determine a mitigation plan or a risk reduction plan. Sometimes the best risk reduction is transfer the risk to an insurance company. Sometimes a business has to accept the risk. Sometimes they have to mitigate the risk. So we have to help prioritize which risks we're going to deal with, and then prioritize a risk mitigation plan to those specific risks. So that's kind of the risk management side. Now, along the way, we're going to have to understand what goes on in their network. So that means we're going to have to work with some network architects, and they're going to have to help explain what's going on the network, where the routing is, what kind of wide area networking exists in the network. And you're going to have to spend a lot of time with the networking team, because there's so many things that could be done on the network. And maybe they're already there as features and you haven't used them. Various types of access control lists and rate limiting and quality of service, depending upon where things are. Network admission control technologies, network encryption, and all kinds of things that you could do on the network, especially segmentation, like no segmentation, VLANs, private VLANs, what have you. So you're going to have to work with the network team, and you're going to have to come up with ideas that they can do, and they're going to advise you on what they can do. After you work with the networking team, guess what you're going to do? You're going to work with the application team, and they're going to be the people that write code, not us. But you're going to have to work with them on things like secure application development methods, and work through processing procedures related to either static or dynamic code checks between the developers themselves. You're going to be recommending things for application security, things like input validation or input sanitation, that kind of things. You can't put bad code in, like in an SQL injection and cat. You're going to discuss best practices. Now, what else will you be doing? Well, you're going to also be looking into the IAM architecture, meaning you're going to be thinking about what kind of authentication you use. Hopefully, it's some type of phishing resistant multi-factor authentication, but you're going to be looking at how we identify the user, how we determine what that user is actually allowed to do, and then how we keep track of it. Now, because we're in the world of multi-clouds and SaaS, that's getting us into the world of cloud access security brokers, which we may design that are going to fit in there. We're definitely dealing with threat-rated IAM in most cases that we're dealing with. We probably, as we're migrating towards zero trust, need something much smarter, like context-aware IAM versus role-based access control. So we're going to try and design that strategy there, or we're going to work with the IAM team to do that. And then after that, we're going to work with the compute people, because now we've got to secure the compute infrastructure. That means maybe the team of the engineers that are going to do that are going to have to remove packages from the Linux system, for example. They're going to have to put some endpoint detection and response things on the servers, the endpoints themselves. If it's Kubernetes, we've got to lock that down because it comes open. So we're going to have to secure the infrastructure and the such. Then we're going to have to approach it from a data perspective. How do we design the data protection scheme? Do we design a data lifecycle to get rid of data off of our systems quickly? So, for example, like if we don't need data and it's no longer providing use to the business, get rid of the data, because if we get attacked and we have the data, that data could be used against us in a lawsuit and there's no value in it. So we need to know when to get rid of data. We also need to think about how do we keep data private. Things like data privacy techniques like tokenization, obfuscation, anonymization, pseudonymization, and what kind of data encryption could you use? How do you protect the data in motion? How do you protect it in flight? And maybe you need to design some homomorphic encryption in there, so even when it's computed in DRAM, it's actually encrypted. So that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be designing a strategy for that, Denver. You're going to have lots of conversations with people. You're going to be looking at every element of architecture. You're going to have to take these architectures, present them to the C-suite, present them to the board, get their buy-in, get their budget so they're willing to pay for it. You're going to have to lead an architecture team. You're going to have to get them from the time we've got the concept to all the conversations that are going to have. You're going to have to be building business cases for security. You're going to be speaking at conferences. You're going to be co-authoring thought leadership documents or authoring thought leadership documents. The only thing you won't be doing in this role is touching the technology. Architects don't touch the technology. And that's why the architect role pays so high. Because the reality is this. It's very easy for me to use AI to configure something. It's also very easy for me to outsource whoever configures the firewalls to someplace far, far, far away, if I trust it, if I open my own offices, for example, unless we're in a government-regulated environment. But what is hard to do is to bring in that person that has the business acumen to hold these conversations, lead these teams, and truly, truly become an architect. So there is no hands-on. And that's the reason, Denver, a lot of times when I've got people with 20 years experience, they take just as much training as when I get someone with a different job, like a sales rep, because engineering and architecture are very different. This is a job of a lot more business, a lot more conversations, a lot more presentations, a lot of eliciting information or obtaining information. Best jobs out there, Denver, but they're not like engineering. Why don't you join us for one of our free architecture webinars, and we'll really go over what we do in depth, all the skills you need, and then we'll make it clear what you do and don't do on these times, because we have time to do it. Great question, Denver, and please feel free to ask more. Like these kinds of questions where people are really thinking. Please bring some questions to me. And Mike, what might be easier approach for a Newberry, a network architect or a security architect? Well, here's the reality. It's all up to you. Now, and what's hard is also up to you. And I'll let you know what I mean. So networking for me was so much fun. And literally speaking, from the time I picked up my first networking book to the time I was a Cisco certified internet expert was 9 months. I loved it that much when I picked up that first Stevens TCPI book and I read it. Well, this is cool. And then when I picked up that first CCI book, Routing and Switching, Routing Volume 1 from Jeff Doyle, I read that thing and I was so excited by it. I read all the internet RFCs. And then all of a sudden there was Bassam Halabi's Internet Routing Architecture book. And I read it. I was like, I read it 3 times. I loved it so much. And for me, that was so simple. Now, that's because networking came naturally to me. Now, you ask me to figure my way around a Windows computer. Now, that does not come easily to me because it's not where it needs to. No, everything feels like it's not where it needs to be, and it's kind of icky to me. So, and I have no issues with Windows. They power the business world for a reason. But, the point is some things come easy to us. Now, I will say after learning network architecture and learning security architecture is a little more high level than network architecture, and I'll explain why. When we're dealing with network architecture, we're dealing with a much more small subset of what we're dealing with. We're designing an IP routing plan, for an example, a route aggregation plan. We're designing a wide area network and our redundancy patterns inside of the wide area network. Like making sure that we have 2 links and they don't come from the same internet service provider, making sure that there's different fiber paths under the ground, making sure there's different conduits coming into the building. I mean, we're really looking at it. So network architecture is a very small area that gets extraordinarily deep. Where security architecture, by its very definition, because there's about 8 components of cybersecurity or 8 domains of it, before we get to the business skills, is much higher level. So I'd say security is probably easier for the average person, security architecture. And I'll tell you right now, security architecture has a greater demand, and the most significant shortage in the world right now is security architecture. It's one of the most critical skills shortages because people confuse it with engineering. They come into the role, they have no idea what an architect is. We interview 500 people and not a single person can pass the interview because they've got 10 certifications but know nothing of architecture. So security architecture probably makes more sense right now. And flying kites, that's why, I created the security architect program before a network architecture program, if I would even create it, because I feel like security right now is one of the best opportunities out there. I love my time in security. And I know I was one of the first, CCIs out there, and I was a principal network architect within 2 years. And I did really enjoy it. And then my time in security, I just loved. And then when I went into enterprise architecture in my more senior years in architecture, I found that was really great too. So it's everything different comes for us. I can't figure out how to use a screwdriver, but I could learn a language. You give me 3 months, 6 months, and I'm fluent in another language. We all have things that come easy and hard. What really matters is you pick what's going to make you happy. But if we're talking salary right now, if we're talking about opportunity right now, I would recommend security architecture. But we ultimately have to do what's going to make us happy. Hi, Mike. Talk to us about data security, SASE, XDR, SIEM, encryption for hybrid enterprise tied to zero trust. Been working around this for a while. So this is a time where we're going to answer career questions, not actual architecture questions, but I'll give you a brief answer into it as well. So let's think about how we really think about zero trust. Never trust, always verify. Assume nothing, assume that we're breached at all times. So if we assume that we're breached all the time and we don't trust anybody, we're going to act in a certain way. So the first thing you really want to think is micro segmentation. So micro segmentation is something that we're going to do. Realistically speaking, identity is going to be the new perimeter. So we're probably going to be segmenting by identity, in addition to network segmentation with various VLANs, various VPCs, ACLs, firewalls, what have you. So if we think about that, if we assume we're breached, we have to make sure, and we don't trust anything, we have to make sure we know what going on where. So micro segment everything. And why? Actually, you know what? Let me just have some fun with it. I'll put these together on some slides so we can kind of map out some of these things. We'll do it real time and live. So let's assume we're in an environment where we assumed we're breached. So what we want to do is we want to segment everything. Oops, no, that's not it. So let's create 2 of these. So if this is app A and this is subnet 1 or app 1, it doesn't really matter. We want to segment this. And why do we want to segment one from the other? Well, we want to limit the blast radius. If we assume that we're breached at all times, we have to be concerned that if a hacker gets into this system, they can get into this system, which they can unless we've got some kind of segmentation between them, which could be just an access list, and it will most likely be perimeter. So one of that is going to be microsegmentation. Now, we assume that we are breached at all times. So we have to do a lot of things. If we assume that we're breached at one time, and we realistically speaking want to know that these 2 hosts can talk to themselves, or system 1, or user 1, it doesn't matter, system 1 to system 2. Now we've got an access control list that blocks everything other than the communication between these 2. So they're still segmented. Now, a couple of things happens. This system has to log into this system, right? It has to be. So we need some good form of authentication between these two systems. And that's going to obviously have to be some kind of token-based system that we're actually dealing with. So we need to know when one system connects to another. Now, we assume that we're breached. So that means we have to encrypt this link at all times because we don't want anybody else to be able to see them. Plus, by assuming we're breached at this time, we can use authentication to prove that system 1 is system 1 and system 2 is system 2, that the messages between system 1 and system 2 haven't actually been changed along the way. So it gives us some additional level of privacy. Now, what are we going to put on these systems? We're going to put these endpoint protection, some of this XDR type stuff on here. And why are we going to do this? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is it's going to make these systems more secure. So this is some kind of endpoint detection and response. So typically some form of a host-based firewall we're dealing with over here that determines what's allowed, some kind of anti-malware, some kind of reporting systems to an IDS, IPS system. So that's going to be going on. Now, remember when system 1 talked to system 2? And they set up their encryptions, they set up their messages. This produces logs. Now, every time something hits one of these host-based firewalls, it produces a log. Sometimes everything hits this XDR system host-based firewall, it produces a log. Anytime any of these systems are actually going here, they're producing the logs. So somewhere along the line, whether it's zero trust or not, we need some kind of SIEM and source system. SIEMs which are going to aggregate the logs so we can correlate it, and source systems to use AI to kind of mitigate these things. So we've got some of this SIEM and some of this SOAR that's obviously going to be going into other systems. So that's not exactly zero trust, but we have to monitor everything that we're doing. So that's why you're going to see these SIEM and source systems that are actually sitting inside of a zero trust architecture. Now, you mentioned key management. We need encryption keys for all this stuff. So there's something like that. Now, if we look at what's going on, we've talked about device authentication, and I've got lots of videos on pure zero trust architecture. We talked about some micro segmentation here. We talked about why we used encryption. So we covered most of the question you asked, but where does SASE fit in? Well, we've got lots of ways that we can connect our environment. So in a perfect world, this is going to be your most secure option. So you have data center 1, and you have data center 2. Now, the most secure thing that you could possibly do is you could get a private line here. And in this private line, you can run some kind of encryption, IPsec, MACsec, whatever. It's just called encryption. And encryption will determine that these data centers are who they are. The messages haven't been changed along the way, and no one can eavesdrop on it. So this is the optimal solution for companies that need it. Now, the key to also remember about this is guaranteed. You buy this at 100 gigs, you're guaranteed to get it. So then we start thinking in terms of how else could we get this? And, what we've done for years for remote access is this, and it worked fairly well, is let's say we've got our home users. We took our home users. They created a VPN into a VPN concentrator that was sitting in the environment. And they were placed in an appropriate subnet with appropriate permissions, and everything worked really great. And then this data center connected to this data. There was never really a problem. And then people started coming up with further wide environments. So we used this for a while. This is your traditional IPsec VPN. And then what we did for a while is we started using software SD. And what we did was what was called the full tunnel to keep these systems secure. Otherwise, they weren't very secure. So in a full tunnel, and let me just show you, this is the data center. What we were doing was we were keeping these people behind the firewall. So what would happen is for all the customers' traffic in a full tunnel, they'd VPN in from their home, they'd VPN into the data center, and all internet would go out the provider's internet, and then it would come back in and then go. So it made the companies need a lot more internet access. So it wasn't the most elegant solution. So, and as people started getting more remote for COVID, we kind of got past this environment. And then what we used for a short period of time is basically we used some SD-WAN, which in SD-WAN was basically optimized routing, use the internet for an IPsec tunnel and get a little help along the way. But we still had that concept of all that, all what was doing. So all SASE really for the most part, it's another type of a VPN approach. So you typically go from your device, you create a tunnel to another environment, and then they create a tunnel back to you. So, it's just one of the wide area network options that we have. The gold standard will always be this, but it all depends on what we need and why we need and where we need it. So that's a 5-minute discussion on something that, in our security architect program, we would spend hundreds of hours on, because people really need to have some depth here, but it's what we can do inside of a career question thing. Hope that helped you. Any tips or resources you would recommend to improve communication skills as an introvert, since an architect role is customer facing and more about communication? So, and I've read 3,000 books, to be fair, and I will tell you that you don't learn how to communicate in a book. Now, there are some books I would recommend. I would truly recommend the book, Why Business People Speak Like Idiots, on true and authentic communication. I also like the book Presenting to Win by Jerry Weissman. Love it. And I would say those two books are good. Now, I'm an introvert too. And what do you have to do to get out of it? You have to have a coach. Now, I want you to think about this. You can go take Linux, figure out how to play your way through Linux and pick up a book. You can. Now, go learn the tango out of a book. Seriously, you're going to get married. You want to do the tango in front of a lot of people. Now go pick up a book and learn the tango. You can. Now go and take a dance class from a really good dance instructor, 4 or 5 1-hour lessons, and you got the basics of a tango. Then you practice in front of that instructor for another 15 weeks, and now you've got a beautiful tango. So the key is you have to be taught some things. Excuse me, I'm having an allergy attack to something. It's probably my cat. But for example, learning how to fly a plane, you have to be taught. You could try to teach yourself, but if you don't land it or don't take off right, it's not going to work. So think about this. I'm so sorry for whatever allergy attack I'm going through. So there's that. So I get a communication coach, or take a course like ours where we teach. We do communication coaching as part of what we do. But if you're not with us, get a communication skills coach and get someone that is real. And why do I say real? The person that doesn't have a job probably isn't there. Now, if you've got a person and they've been a director or a VP or a strategist or something like that, and all of a sudden now they've got a communication skills course, they're coaching, they can help you. So I can tell you what I did is I got an executive coach, which helped me. And I did presentation after presentation after presentation. And I had a presentation coach coach me and groom me just like I do for my students. And I also went to a tremendous number of classes. I always talk about speakeasy. They're about $3,000 for about 2 days or 3 days, but you get some really good presentations, communication skills training there. And I liked it. I went there many times as well as other places, but that's really the key. Or take a course like ours, but you got to get there and you got to do it. And when you speak and you present, someone's got to tell you, use more energy or less energy, use more gestures or less gestures, take up more space or less space, change your vocal tone here, pause here, because the real element of communication is not the words you say. So what if I told you, and this study originally came from Harvard and is widely used by every professional coach in the world, when you speak, 7% of the content that comes across in your overall communication is what you're actually saying. As ridiculous as it sounds, 55% is what you look like. Watch. Security architecture is about keeping an organization safe. Now, security architecture is about protecting the client organization. You see it, you feel it, it's different. So it takes someone that can look at you, they can say, do this, change this. And usually when I coach communication, I usually include a lot of techniques to help reduce anxiety. I spent 18 years practicing yoga. I loved it so much I became a yoga instructor, not to teach yoga, but just to be able to integrate it more for myself. We've got some yoga breathing. They're called pranayama techniques. We have some tactical breathing techniques that's widely used by warriors. We have some cognitive behavior therapy, and it's in our program. Why? Because they did my clinical rotations at Penn, and they were the experts of cognitive behavior therapy, but it's being used by Olympians, elite warriors, to stay in the game and be able to keep their anxiety down. And I want to make sure we keep your anxiety down before your presentations, before your interviews, and before everything that matters, so you can excel. So make sure you get somebody to teach you. We teach you in any of our architecture training programs, but if you're not with us, get someone to teach you, because sure, you can read, but go read, which is written word, and then actually go present it. So hope that helps. Good questions, though. James, as someone working in healthcare, you're interested in transitioning into a cloud security architect role. Could I give you some guidance on how to achieve this? So a friend of mine who was a student of mine just got hired by a global bank, and it's his first tech job. He is a radiology professional. I am an internal medicine professional. So James, when I was a kid, I paid my way through college by being a firefighter paramedic. Then I was a registered nurse for about 6 months. Didn't last long in that role. I went to school for a couple more years, became a nurse practitioner, had an internal medicine office, and determined that I loved tech. So I'll tell you what I did. And I went and studied for a network architect role. And why don't you please come to our webinar on how to be a security architect? And you know what? Come to our webinar tonight on how to be an enterprise architect, because I do want you to understand, coming from a healthcare background, you probably have 50% of the skills for an enterprise architect role already. 50% of enterprise architects don't come from a tech background, and usually healthcare is such a good background that it's an opportunity for you to realize that enterprise architecture may actually pay you more, and you might be easier for you to learn. So please come to the enterprise architect webinar tonight. But you're going to do great in any architect role, and let me tell you why. I'm going to bring out, and if you could tell me what you actually do in healthcare, it will help me more. But I'm going to pull out a skills list that we have for the cloud security architect role. And then I want to show you where I think you're going to do well based upon healthcare. But if you tell me which healthcare role, I can get even more granular. So here's a document or a slide that that Alonzo and I put together. Let me kind of make this look a little better for you so you can see all sides of it, or I'll minimize this just a touch for you. So if we actually look at the skill for a security architect, I'm going to talk about which ones healthcare people usually have first and why. Now, you have to know business. So that's why for any architect role, so, that's why we teach business. Otherwise, I say get an MBA. You have to know how to speak to the C-suite. We're going to have to teach you that, or anyone that. I don't expect you to come from background. Now, stakeholder management you might actually have in healthcare, because often we have to coordinate care between a patient and 5 or 6 different caregivers. So many healthcare people kind of have that. Now, when I went to school, we were taught something called therapeutic communication and empathy, and that's the basis of emotional intelligence. And generally speaking, all healthcare providers have a high degree of emotional intelligence, except for sometimes surgeons, and some do, some don't. But generally speaking, medical people that have to talk to people, diagnose, treat, have a high degree of emotional intelligence. In healthcare, we've got to document, and we've got to do it in an efficient way. It's not executive writing, but at least it's something. Now, when I first prescribed Coumadin or warfarin for a patient 27 years ago, 28 years ago, I remember the patient didn't want to take it. And my preceptor said to me, he said, Mike, he said, you need to learn how to sell. And he could say, if you can't convince your patient to take their medication, they're going to die. So, the reality is I have to learn how to sell in healthcare, and I'm sure you know that. Now, healthcare people have expertise in eliciting information or getting information from patients. So you're going to have a lot of knowledge there. You, generally speaking, in healthcare have to exercise some degree of influence, whether it's a nurse calling a doctor saying the patient has this and I want to give this medication. Do you approve it? And that's exercising influence. Or it's when a patient is struggling and you guide them towards the right decision. So you're probably good there. Process optimization, you're going to have to learn about. Presentation skills, you may or may not have. Executive communication, we're going to have to retrain you in an executive presence unless you've been a hospital administrator. Change management, you probably have a little bit more knowledge here from, okay, you want to just, a patient gets discharged, what has to happen? How do they have to adapt to their life potentially? What kind of PT, OT, how does the home have to change? So if you know anything about that, you have some knowledge of change management and culture. And then, of course, the business piece, strategy, negotiation, you would have to learn. I don't get that from most healthcare people. And then it's just learning the security side. Now, the key is when I get a healthcare professional or a sales rep, they usually have at least half of these things. When I get someone, for example, like a network security engineer, they typically know network security, but not the rest of these things. And that's what's different about engineering. And in engineering, a person's career will be in data security and they'll never see the rest of this. Or it'll be in network security and they'll never see the rest of this. And that's why, generally speaking, engineering is so different than architecture, because we're going to have to need all these skills and create a strategy, where engineers might spend a lot of time building things. So I kind of hope that helps you better understand it. That's really what you need to do. How cloud computing? How do you pick up business or acumen skills? Any resource for that? Sure. I went and got a 1.5 master's you get an MBA, or you take a course like ours, but a master's in business administration is, basic business administration training. And that's what I did. I didn't have a course like ours, so I got an MBA. And then when I was done that, I took about 6 figures worth of of executive training, lots of presentation skills training, lots of executive presence training, lots of CXO relevancy training, lots of sales training, a lot of sales training. So those types of things, that's how you pick it up. Also, when I was in my ABA program, read 3 books per week, and I did that for my entire career. Books on business acumen would be things like books on finance, books on managerial finance, books on accounting, for example, books on marketing, books on organizational dynamics, books on business process optimization, those kind of things, business architecture, anything related. That's your business acumen skills. So that's the reason we earn so much in architecture roles is you can't just read a book and know. You've got to be taught. It's kind of like a physician. You have to be trained for the job. You have to have a specific set of skills. And that keeps out the majority of the people that think they can just read 1 book or 2 books and pick it up. But you can definitely learn this. But if you don't train with us, I strongly recommend an MBA. And if you train with us, I can tell you what we do. We look at an entire MBA curriculum. For the most part, we get rid of all the fluff in an MBA program because there's a lot of it that you don't need. And that's kind of the basis of what we teach inside of our programs, is that because you need to know, basically you need that MBA where you can walk in and look at a company's balance sheet and understand what looks good and what doesn't look good. When you can read the financial statement and understand opportunities for investments to change the strategy for that company. When you can look at an organization and say, you've got the wrong operating model. You need to be using a different operating model because the way your business is, you need strong processes at each end, but you don't need tightly coupled systems, for example, and you're going to benefit from this. And that you need to be able to figure out. Being able to look at the organization's key business and being able to map out the business architecture, how things get done, to be able to map out the value streams of that organization, to be able to map out that business capabilities, and then looking at those capabilities, determine how we take weaknesses and turn them into strengths, and real capabilities and turn them into competitive advantage. So that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about creating the strategy, presenting that strategy to the C-suite, potentially recommending investments after looking at, say, a portfolio of 10 investments and determining which has the greatest expected value to deliver the right ROI for our client. We're talking about developing a business case and a return on investment capital model and being able to determine how do you measure the effectiveness of an architecture. For example, we spent $1 million on this and we got $2 million back at a 35% margin. Okay, we lost money on that when all is said and done. So to be able to look at that, and that's what I'm talking about, and that's what every great architect can do. And that's what separates the $500,000 architects and $750,000 architects from those at the lowest level. That level of business acumen. The better your business acumen is, the better your salary. So I recommend an MBA. You know why do I recommend it? When I was young, I obviously have another master's degree in healthcare, and then I went and did 2/3 to 3/4 of an MBA at Drexel University. And what I didn't expect to happen happened. I got this massive opportunity in tech, and I literally didn't finish the first MBA because I had to take the job, and it was like 100 miles away, and that was pre-online training. And then I have to tell you, years later, I went and got another MBA. And guess what? After that MBA, then I started getting sent to executive training. I moved into an enterprise architect role, chief architect roles, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I spent about a decade as a chief architect at Cisco for the entire healthcare vertical. So that's really what I recommend, is either take a course like we made or do exactly what I did. And you'll be good to go. Peter, what advice would I give someone that is faced with two career options, security architect versus security engineer, and why? So, Peter, I'll be very clear. Things that engineers do: code, configure firewalls, configure IDS, IPS systems, configure VPN concentrators. I can use AI to do that. So, Peter, you may notice that we used to have a cloud engineering program, and it was a pretty significant program. Very global program. Our students did real well. Almost 3 years ago, I decided to say we can no longer open or sell any cloud engineering jobs. I said, because engineering jobs are going to get automated out. So I expect to see a mass layoff in engineering space. Now, Peter, and what are we seeing? We're seeing companies do a layoff of 10,000 engineers. And then the next day, I hire sales reps, hire solutions architects, hire sales engineers. Every day we're seeing this. And why is that? Because every piece of technology creates a new opportunity for business, for competitive advantage. And that's where architects go. Engineers build it, architects design it. So there's that. Now, if you look at the actual skills that you need for an architect role, a security architect, I want you to know why they're not automatable. So AI can write code. We can do that right now. We could write a program by just asking AI to do it. I could go to AI right now and ask it to write a configuration script to configure a Cisco firewall or a Palo Alto firewall. And within 30 seconds or a minute or two, you can edit and it'll be good. So, I mean, there's that. But you know what AI can't do? Any of the actual security architect skills. And by the way, while we're at it, security architect roles typically pay double security engineering roles. And they typically get you further. But let's talk about why these roles can't be automated. Because you need to be able to look at the organization as business and find business inefficiencies in any architect role. You need to be able to help that organization create a strategy. Now, in order to create a strategy, it means meeting with 50 people, 100 people, understanding where the market is going, seeing and listening to conversations, what people are saying, being able to follow the money, being able to look at technology roadmaps of the future and figure out how do you create a competitive advantage. So typically speaking, that is a role that can't be automated. Now, in any architectural role, you're going to have to negotiate between stakeholders. You're going to have to negotiate between vendors. And, AI doesn't negotiate. Now, when you create a new security architecture, you have to change the culture that goes along with it. So that means training, management programs, marketing collateral. If you don't, you're 7 times less likely to be successful. So you're going to have to focus a lot of that. And all of that is person to person, human to human work with executives. So guess what? Again, that can't be automated by AI. Now, you need to be able to convince the C-suite and the board potentially to spend $50 to $75 million on security. And if we actually look at that, when we go back to look at that, that's going to take a lot of executive presence and executive communication. Again, that can't be done by AI. Now, for a security architect job, every day, you're going to be presenting to executives, presenting at conferences, presenting at the C-suite. So you're going to be giving presentations, and nobody's buying $1 billion anything off of a presentation. Now, you're going to have to be able to exercise influence and be able to change an organizational culture for what you need. So you're going to ultimately have to have influence. You'll have to be an expert at pulling information out of the right people. When it comes to security architecture, it's nothing like a silly AWS certification where they show you a bunch of AWS stuff. I mean, let's be real. You're probably going to have 20 security vendors and 15 to 50 application vendors and a couple of networking vendors and a couple of IAM vendors. We're going to have to work through a lot of people and manage them. Sales, we have to convince them to buy our architecture, because if they get hacked because we couldn't sell it to them, that's it. We have to manage stakeholders. We have to communicate to the C-suite, and we have to smooth out ruffled feathers. So none of these things can actually be done by AI. And if you actually look at the skills of the future, the way the World Health or the way the World Economic Forum looked at it, you can look at all the skills they've planned for the future. I'll show you those. So if we look here, we can look at jobs that are dead, out of focus skills. Out of focus is things like, and I'm one of them, I speak multiple languages to communicate across different worlds, but AI can translate it now. The people that do the same thing every day with their hands. Quality control is dead because AI can start doing these kind of things. Programming is dead because AI can do it. This kind of stuff is the dead skills, but what's not? AI and big data. Well, hope that makes sense to everybody. And securing this stuff. Systems thinking. Ooh, where most people know how to configure that firewall, that's not what we need. We need to know the person that understands when Aguilo in Athens puts a rule on the firewall. What impact does that have to someone in Ethiopia? What impact does that have to someone in Tokyo? What impact does that have to someone in New York City? So that's all systems thinking of what. Being able to be empathetic, communicate with our clients, that's half of what we do. 50% of our work is conversations. Motivating others, definitely our job. Now, we will have to lead a client. Remember I talked about leadership and influence skills? That's 50%, 40, 30 to 50% of our job, leading with stakeholders, managing that. So again, coming up with creative and analytical thinking, that's what we do as architects. Managing teams and talent, that's a lot of what we do as architects. So when the World Economic Forum came up with all the skills for the future, they actually mapped out exactly the architect role. So that's why I wouldn't study engineering, because if you study engineering, I wouldn't feel very safe recommending it as a job with the future. Great questions. If you got them, bring them. Otherwise, bring the questions to me. Backhand team. Hi, Mike. Is governance part of security architecture? Yeah, that's probably 40% of where we spend our time is creating a governance structure and all the things that are necessary for governance. A huge component of our governance for regulations, governance for, yeah, absolutely. Major component. Super Green Samurai. Hi, Mike. Thoughts on how a data center like US East could crash? So, Super Green Samurai, let's talk about how an entire cloud would crash, because how any data center could crash is easy. And yesterday, there was an outage which was DNS related, so who knows? So we have to look at what goes on in a cloud provider's data center. And let's talk about what goes on in any data center. So I'll draw you a cloud. I'll show you how and where the cloud could break. And I'll show you where your weaknesses are. So this first thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you why a multi-region architecture is still not enough to ever depend upon, to ever defend against a cloud outage, and why you need more than one cloud. So let's say we've got a cloud, and I'm going to show you what we typically do. We've got a couple of data centers in multiple regions. And by the way, there's more than one there's more than one data center in the Amazon region in US East. There's a lot of them. So it's not just one data center that's down. So let's put it to context. So let's say you've got a couple of data centers in an area. And I'll give you a couple things that get fairly complex, and then I'll show you how the entire cloud works. So you've got a couple of data centers in an area. Now inside here, you've got private networking. So typically you've got like an OSPF routed core in each data center, or in intermediate systems to intermediate systems. They're the two choices. We might have some multi-protocol label switching running on here. We've got a whole bunch of VLAN, so we probably got some DMVPN stuff going on here. So there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong in here. The routing could go wrong. The hardware could actually fail. They could get hit by a bug. There could be a DDoS attack on any of these systems. Somebody could make a misconfiguration. So any of this stuff could go bad. And truthfully, this is a region. So and then I'm going to call this a region while we're at it. So everything in this region could crash. Now, then we now have to look at, let's say we have 2 regions. And let's say we have 3 regions, quite honestly. Let's do this. So now we've got 3 of these regions. And typically the way you create these things is you create them mostly separate. They all run their own independent interior gateway protocols. They all have redundant power, redundant switches, redundant cooling. And they're all connected to each other via an exterior gateway protocol like BGP. And I'll show you why we use BGP here. So basically speaking, we run eBGP between these organizations. And eBGP passes on the routing information that's necessary from point A to point B, but not all of it. And that way we can hopefully limit an attack that occurs in, say, one region to the rest. But what you have to understand is there is a common network between these things. And you also have to understand another common weakness, which is the control plane. So there, you can go to any management console or any infrastructure as script and magically deploy stuff and all of this stuff. Now that means there is a software layer that rides on top of this thing. And all you have to do is have a crash in your software layer and all of this stuff goes down. So that's no good either. Now, if this thing gets hacked, if there's a malfunction here, the whole cloud goes down. Now, we could be having another DDoS attack that nobody's told us about. I'm not saying we are or not. Now, all of a sudden, this thing gets hit with any kind of major security attack, and it can take this or all of this down. So you can't ever have high availability on a single cloud. And anybody that tells you that is lying to you, because any of these things could go wrong. So what do organizations do? So this is what 30 years ago we learned in networking. So I'll put it into context and let me show you why multi-cloud doesn't cost double the money. The people that say that just don't understand cloud computing. So here's what we used to do. So let's say this was New York, and the wide area network providers are also cloud providers. So this is New York, and let's say this was London. Now we ultimately had 2 clouds, and they were the ISPs that we would use. So let's say this was the Verizon cloud. Oops, let's go back here. Let's say this was a Verizon link. Now, let's say we put another Verizon link, and we were smart enough to make sure they don't go through the same underground copper wires or connections. Now, all of a sudden, everything's running smooth. Billy Bob with the backhoe cuts this cable. The other cable is working. Great. Now, all of a sudden, Verizon has a global outage, and could be any internet service provider, and you're done. Now, that would be stupid. Nobody would really do that in real world, and they haven't done it for 30 years. So what do? If this link is on Verizon, and Verizon's a great wide area network provider, internet service provider, well, then maybe this link is on British Telecom. And that way, if the British Telecom link gets beaten up by a backhaul, a cable cut, so what? You've got Verizon. If the Verizon link goes down, so what? Who cares? Now, all of a sudden, British Telecom has a massive outage in their entire network. It's okay because Verizon still works. So this is what everybody does. Now, I want you to think about this. I could buy 2 links from BT. Let's say each link is $5,000 a month. I buy 2 links from British Telecom, and I've got a single point of failure, and I spend 10 grand a month. I spend 5 grand a month to British Telecom and 5 grand a month to Verizon, and I still have $10,000 a month, and now I've got full redundancy. So I kind of hope that actually helps. Now, what do we do in the cloud, potentially speaking? Let's say we put it 50-50. We have DNS, and you see how AWS's DNS went down today? We always said you can't use the cloud provider's DNS. Don't waste your time with a Route 53. Use your own. So realistically speaking, here you've got your own DNS. Maybe it's F5, maybe it's bind, whatever. But you've got your own, you manage your own DNS in both places. It's very, very simple to do. It's an inexpensive skill set to do this. It's a whole lot of nothing. And now you put 50% in here. And guess what? You put the other 50% in here. And it doesn't cost you any more for the most part to run half and half. Now, let's say it's a web application. You've got DNS between both of them, and you manage the DNS because you know that if you use AWS DNS and AWS has an outage, chances are your Azure won't work. So you use your own DNS and your own container orchestration strategy, and you use more industrial tools. Now, either one of these clouds goes down. I'm going to use AWS because they're down today, right? And all of a sudden, traffic gets shifted over to Azure, all your stuff's in some kind of auto-scaling group, what have you. And immediately you've got 50% capacity, and 20, 30 minutes later, Azure's at 100%. When AWS comes back after they fix their whatever their problem is, your traffic gets automatically shifted back to AWS, and now you're back at 50 and 50. And guess what? You survived it. AWS get hits with a DDoS attack. Who cares? You run on another cloud. AWS control plane goes down. Who cares? So you don't want to be a hospital to put all your stuff in here. AWS goes down and patients die because doctors and nurses can't access their system. So this is why I've always taught how to design hybrid multi-cloud architectures to every student in cloud computing ever, because no serious organization would do single cloud. And that's why 98% of enterprises use more than one cloud. Now, granted, there were a couple businesses that didn't. For example, the people we typically stream with, we're down because AWS is down. So if we don't build our infrastructure ourselves at Go Cloud Careers, if we use a SaaS provider, we have two. We have two video streaming platforms just in case one goes down, because we know a lot of them are smaller businesses and they don't know multi-cloud architecture, so they use a single cloud and they've got outages and outages and outages. I hope that makes sense. Good questions today. I'm really happy to hear these, to see them. And if you've got questions, please bring them in. What's the difference between a senior information security analyst and a security architect? Completely unrelated to each other. Anyone can become a cloud architect. Anybody can become a security architect. And guess what? Learning how to be an airplane pilot will not teach you how to be a security architect. Learning how to be a cloud architect will not teach you how to be a security architect either. It will teach you how to be a cloud architect. Learning how to be a security architect will teach you how to be a security architect. And there's no reason that one precedes the other. Because let's think about it. Would you go to medical school to become a physician if your goal was to become an attorney? So no, anybody can do it. So, I mean, I've got people in enterprise architecture roles. Now, salespeople admittedly always have an advantage because they've got a very similar skill set. So Wallace Agana, for example, sales rep. 8, 9 months later, enterprise architect at JP Morgan Chase. Another sales rep, Jermaine, selling landscaping gear. A year later, working as an enterprise architect. Now, security. Delroy Batt, you can see a video of him. He was an emergency medical technician. He came to us. Took some security boot camp, couldn't get any jobs for about 6 months, 9 months, came to us. Within about 3 weeks to a month in our program, he got some kind of cybersecurity engineering job. And he stayed in our program for about 13 months and then got hired at CDW. It was his first tech job, just like Yvonne's first tech job. Out of college after being a waiter, was working at AWS as a solutions architect, just like Nafuli's first job in Manchester, UK, was a chief technology officer. It's all about your skills. I went from internal medicine one day to principal solutions architect within 2 years, and you can too. But an information security analyst is someone who monitors stuff, monitor stuff, monitor stuff, monitor stuff, monitor stuff. A security architect is a strategist. So I've spent a lot of time as a security architect. I've never spent a minute as an information security analyst, because it has honestly nothing to do with security architecture. It has everything to do with hands-on. So I want you to kind of think about the difference. Say a strategist is the person that's designing the battle plan. for a three-pronged attack on something. I don't care what it is. So you know how the strategist is always going to be thousands of miles away. They're going to be looking at satellite information or whatever, or any kind of TVs, figure out what's going on where. Now you have the people that are on the ground. They're doing the job. They have a completely different set of skills than the people that are working far away doing strategy. The person that designs the city plans of where the roads are going to be, where the parks are going to be, for example, how much the capacity of the roads, where the exits and entries on the highway, has a completely different set of skills than the people that are delivering the mail in that city. So if you get the right training, you'll easily become an architect. So the analyst is more of that monitoring. The security architect's going to be meeting with the C-suite. You're going to be meeting with stakeholders. You're going to be creating a team of security people. You're going to be leading a team to create the architecture. You're going to be communicating with vendors and determine which vendors can fill in various things. For example, who will your SIEM systems be? And when you consider your SIEM systems, you may have multiple companies. Each SIEM system does something different than the others. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. So you're going to be evaluating, okay, the features and functionality of the Cisco one versus the Microsoft one, and which one's better for your organization. Not better tech. Okay, you're going to use 2 layers of next generation firewalls at the egress of your systems. You've evaluated Checkpoint, Fortinet, Cisco, Palo Alto, and F5. Which ones are you going to use and why? What are the strengths that you need to do? If you use 2 layers, did you use 2 people with similar functionality, or did you use people with very different algorithms? And what's your rationale for that and why? You recommending a context-aware identity and access management system? Why are you recommending it? What's it going to give you over the attribute base that they're already using? Why do you want to make this risk? So the architect is looking at everything. So if I can describe it, so I used to practice internal medicine. And internal medicine is exactly like the security architect role. And I can show you the difference. And I can give you the difference between someone that does something that's, the analyst would be considered more the technician oriented. So when a patient comes to me in an office and then when I deal with an architecture, they come to me for a problem. They have a problem that needs to be solved. So somebody comes to me for a sore throat. And I say, what brings you in today? And they say, I have a problem. When I go on an architecture thing, thank you for bringing me in. How can I help you? What are we trying to achieve? It's the same thing. Now, when I interview patients, let's say I've got a patient that's got a sore throat. I ask some questions. What makes your throat better? What makes your throat worse? Is there anything that makes this better? And I get some information. I might even look in the throat. I notice that it's red and swollen. So same thing in an architect role. I create a team. I have a team of engineers. They're looking at architects. Some of the engineers are looking at the tech. They're giving me reports on what I have or what we have, for example. And then as a doctor, I make a diagnosis. And an architect, I generate a hypothesis. And as a doctor or nurse practitioner, I build a plan. Okay, for your pharyngitis, you're not allergic to penicillin. I'll give you amoxicillin, 500 milligrams 4 times a day. If you're not better in 2 weeks, come back to me. As an architect, I give them a blueprint. So you can look at the doctor as that kind of architect role. Now, in healthcare, we have people that help us do various jobs, people that draw blood, for example, that are phlebotomists, or people that take a patient from point A in the hospital to point B, or people that work in a lab and actually run blood and urine tests to make sure we have what we need. That's more the analyst type role. So what you have to do is you have to go from that one singular focus to the entire focus in the scheme of things. So it's a great thing. Join me on one of the architect webinars. You'll see what we have. And what I can do if you want, JC, is depending upon how you work and how you learn on the job, I can actually assess you and see what skills you do have versus what skills you don't, and then make recommendations. But you can become anything you want. Anything you want. Want to be a nurse practitioner like me and be a network architect 2 years later? No big, or 9 months later, no big deal. You get the right training, you get the right skills, and you're there. But just don't assume engineering gets you to architecture. It's a completely different set of skills. It's like a nurse that's been a nurse for 10 years, still have to go to medical school for the same period of time to become a physician because it's different. Hope that helps. But it's a great job and I highly recommend it. What's the difference between the role of a security architect and principal information security personnel. So principal information security personnel is a term that I have no idea what it means. And let's talk about so what it probably is a principal engineer, and they didn't know what to call the person, like a principal design engineer. So we have people that, like me, that are architects, like David Lithicum, that's architects, like Russ White, that are actual architects. And we're focusing purely on that strategy. And we may have design engineers who help us that are superstar engineers. They're like the principal engineers of the world. And the difference between them and the regular engineers is the regular engineers are just configuring the firewall. They're typing in a lot of stuff. They're doing a lot of basic things. The principal engineers are looking things that are complex. Where do I put my firewall? How many levels? Where's the breaking points of the firewall? If we enable these features, our firewall functionality comes down to this. Those principal engineers are going to every conference. They're going to everything, and they're really strong tech experts. In fact, in many cases, they actually serve us as architects as a support staff. Like they work on our team as a tech expert, which helps us a lot, where we're focusing more on the strategy. So we're writing the security policy. We're coming up with incident response procedures. We're evaluating an asset. We're evaluating the risk to that asset. We're evaluating vulnerabilities to the system. We're evaluating various threats and whether they be applicable to our system. We're going out there and looking at our business processes and looking for weaknesses from a security perspective there. We're looking at the strategy of the organization for the future and say, they want this. We're going to be looking at their 5 SaaS applications and say, okay, we've got a data loss prevention problem here. We've got no controls over this. So maybe we need a cloud access security broker. And how do we set up that? What kind of proxies do we use to that? And why do we need it? More and more looking for as us, can we use standard multi-factor authentication, or do we need something more specific that's resistant to, say, phishing, like a fingerprint, what have you, on your device, or an iris scan or a retina scan? And if we use a retina scan versus an iris scan, what are the legal issues there? For example, in a retina scan, we're getting the back of the eye and the retina, which has got a set of blood vessel patterns, which is kind of like a fingerprint to you. In effect, it's medical information. Whereas if we use the iris, it's just scanning the top of your eye. If I use a retina scan, you got to get close to the sensor, but it's very accurate. If I use the iris, its iris is very simple and convenient, for example. So we have to do with that. And then what we're doing, Arnold, is we're looking at them, we're creating strategies, we're creating recommendations, we're presenting it to the C-suite and the stakeholders, getting their buy-in and coming. We're creating architectural contracts, statements of work, training protocols and programs, all kinds of good stuff, lots of documentation. So architecture is all about strategy. Principal information security people most likely is a principal engineer, and they're going to be the smartest engineers that company has. And as a rule, those engineers, the principal engineers, are immune from AI because typically speaking, their skills are so good that AI can't replace it. It's not like someone that knows a little of 10 different jobs, but not enough to be good at any one of them. That's what gets replaced by AI. These principal engineers are usually pretty strong, real strong, and very smart. Great question, Arnold. My father's name, interestingly enough. Demo. I love that name. Any chance it's Demos? Out of just curiosity? Then again, I Greekify everybody's name. Thank you for the mapping, Mike. Well put together. You're curious as a cyber architect, data security focused. What other career options do you have later? You love cyber, but not big into hands-on. So Demo, if you're touching anything in a cyber architect role, you're not doing architecture, you're doing design engineering. And if we put you in a real security architect role, for example, where you're not touching the technology, you're influencing the C-suite, what have you, it'd probably give you a 30 or 40% raise right then and there, and you'd stay as a security architect. Now, I'm going to give you both options. Actually, you know what, Demo? Let me map it out for you when you come back, because then I can show you where you've gone and where I've taken people like you. And I can take you to any of these 3 places, and you have the options to go to these 3 places. Now, the choices you make, the jobs you take, and the training you take will determine where you go. So let's say you're in what you're at, which is what I'm going to call a technical architect role, because that's really what it is. If you're touching the technology, it's not an architect job. It's a technical architect, which is the same as like a principal engineer. And to go from here, let me show you what would happen. If we would increase your overall security well-roundedness and your executive skills just a little bit. So with a little bit of polish, you'd move into a security architect role. Now, that should be for someone like you, if we've got it right, around a $300,000 role. 229 is about average, but if you're coming from that technical architect perspective, it should be at least $300,000 a year. Now, that gets us to here. Now, we have multiple options from the security architect, and I want to show you what they actually are. You've got 3 big decision points that you would go to. So option 1 is we train you in a security specialty, say AI security. And we still boosted your business acumen, your leadership, your communications, what have you. Now we put that, and then we do this. This gets you in the world of the principal or / distinguished architects. These can still be a good job. For example, a principal architect at Google is about a $500,000 job. Principal architect at Microsoft is about a $380,000 job on average. Same thing for about AWS, right up there with Cisco and others. They're fairly similar. So that's going to be that technical strategist. Now, your next option is to increase your executive skills. And as a rule, we increase your executive skills. That gives you 2 other options. We can move you into more a leadership position, which could go from this. And you could take those leadership positions to a CISO position years later. Alternative 2 is we give you more executive skills, much more business acumen. And that moves you into an enterprise architect role. And that easily goes into leadership there, or you can go to a chief architect role. Now, this chief architect role could be a $500,000, $800,000 role or more in most enterprises. And then that moves into the CIO type role. And because in the enterprise architect job, you're constantly interacting with the C-suite, you're constantly interacting with the leadership, you're constantly interacting with the board, you know, it could go from a CIO to maybe a COO position later. So I have done both. And what I can tell you was in my youth, I was a technical architect for about a year or 2. And I can tell you what changed everything for me. And I'm going to give you the same favor. I went to Cisco. So I was a principal architect at Riverstone. I had worked on Wall Street as a senior architect. I was a lead architect at MCI WorldCom. They're now Verizon. And then I went to Cisco. And I had a manager that really did me the biggest favor in the world. And he said, Mike, and I just fell asleep in a CISSP boot camp that they were doing on site. Thought my manager was going to yell at me. And he's like, Mike, I got a bonus for you for doing a good job and a recommendation for you. And he says, you're not like the rest. I'm like, oh, okay. I'm like, I don't know what that means, good, bad, or different. And he said, the rest of these people see boxes. He says, you don't look at a box. You figure what kind of business strategy you can create, what kind of technology credit versus the box. And he said, you're good at it. He said, but where I see you is you're not good enough. And I said, let me know exactly what I mean. He said, imagine if you can go from these $40 million technology architectures that you're designing to $1 billion architectures. Imagine instead of a team that you have of 10 people, if you could lead a team of 100 people. Imagine if when a company came to you and said, we want to increase our revenue, you could find a way to do it for them. When that bank comes to you and says, we're looking for new business capabilities from our financial advisors, how would you give it to them? And I said, that sounds like fun to learn. And he said, that's why I'm saying it. So he made me go get an MBA. I got about almost $100,000 of training and executive skills after that Cisco paid for. CXO relevant, sales training, executive presence, those kinds of things. And then poof, I was in these huge architect roles, and that's what happened. So that's why I created our executive architect program, because that's really the focus of that one. But I want to let you know, Demo, this is a great place where you're already at. You're already in a technical architect role. All we've got to do is get you more business skills, more executive skills, and then figure out, do you want to be a manager? Do you want to move up into the security realms, the distinguished architect type, potentially the CIO roles, or do you want to move into a bigger, more executive role? All your options. And it's all about where you focus your time and your skills. Focus more time in the tech, typically going to cost you. Focus more time on the business, the strategy, the leadership. That's the way up. That's the way forward. Ever, how much time is spent on architectural design versus policy and governance? I'd say about 50-50. I would say that the majority of your time will actually be communicating and managing stakeholders. That's going to be about 50 or 60% of your time, which means people that have an interest in the outcome, which will be business units heads, department heads, IT leadership, and all of it. So that's about half of your time. And you're going to need that to know what various components of the business need to even create your strategy. But about 50-50. Great question there, Denver. Lyman, like Daniel Lyman. I wonder if you're related. Hi, Mike. You studied electrical engineering and worked in the telco industry for 12 plus years as a customer care rep. You recently considered a cybersecurity and cloud computing RES. My team know what the rest of that is? Do we have a second half of this question? That's it. You know what? I don't know how to answer that because I don't know what the question actually is. It looks more like a statement. So Dell, if you've got a question, please rephrase it or tell us what we actually need, and I'm happy to come back to you. Jeremiah, what's a better space? Enterprise architecture, security architecture, or AI architecture? The aspects that you would like to understand are income potential, demand, and job security. So I'm going to talk short-term demand versus long-term demand. Short-term, there's massive shortages in AI. Everybody pretends to be an AI expert, but most people don't even know that people like me and David Lithwick have been working with AI for decades. They just thought it came out a year ago. So the key is, in the short term, you think AI, and sure, there's $1 million AI architect salaries. But Jeremiah, I always want you to think about what I thought about. So when I started my tech career, a couple things. One is I was infatuated with networking, and I always looked to do something else. I always focus on supply and demand curves. And what I mean by that is I determine what the demand is, what the supply is, and what people are going where. So when I was younger, everybody said, learn to code. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. I'm not going to learn to code. Everybody's told to learn the code, and I was right. When I picked networking, no one knew what networking was. Everybody was learning to code, and the networking people were earning 3 and 4 and 5 times what the software people were when I started. Why? Because everybody was going one where. So in architecture, you have basically and AI architecture is great. We have a great AI architecture program that David Lithwick teaches, and it's wonderful. Now, me personally, I like security architecture more, and I like enterprise architecture more, even though AI architecture is great and there's a career potential, and I'm going to tell you why. If we look at 95% of the ridiculous AI architectures that have come out there, they weren't designed by AI architects, they were designed by engineers, and they're failing miserably. And if you look at companies that are great at AI, like Google, for example, YouTube and all their things, they're making a killing on it. So, or Salesforce got rid of 40% of their team, and they're doing great. So with AI, so let's talk about why I like enterprise architecture and security architecture, and they're both great. Enterprise architecture is the hidden architect career that nobody knows about, that every company has, every company needs, and because there's no supply, they're always willing to pay. Always. So the enterprise architect requires the most business acumen. It is the most executive of the bunch, and it is the straightest to the C-suite, which is what I did. Enterprise architect, CEO. You know, I learned how to be a C-suite by advising the C-suite in that enterprise architect role. So if you're looking to go more C-suite side, it's enterprise architecture. Wanting to go towards that VP, SVP side, more enterprise architecture. Now, why do I love security architecture? No one understands it. I get people that come to me. I could interview 1,000 people and ask them basic security architecture questions, and no one can answer them. I can find someone that can configure a firewall, but I literally can't find. It's impossible for me to find a security architect. And here's why. If I were to say right now to all of you, design a zero trust architecture for an enterprise with 300,000 employees that's spread across 57 countries, how many would you know how to do it? If I were to look at right now and say, I've got an organization with $80 million of risk exposure, and you need to build a business case for security, how many people could do it? If I asked how many of you can convince a C-suite to spend $300 million on a security architecture, how many of you know how to do it? If I say, how would you work across 150 stakeholders for the next 9 months? Would you know how to do it? So because of that, and that's the key, nobody knows how to do these things in security architecture. They've done 1,000 hands-on labs, know nothing of architecture, so they're very easy to, so it's very hard to get an architect. So where everybody's focused on AI right now, I want to learn AI, I want to learn AI, I want to learn AI. Do you know what they're not focused on? Securing AI. And AI presents such a massive security threat to us. And there's going to be a lot that goes to it. So what you're going to see, and I've seen it time and time and time again, the thing that nobody thinks about, like security or networking, becomes the hottest tech skill in the world. World Economic Forum said we were short by about 5.5 million cybersecurity professionals. And what any of us can tell you is I can find all the security pluses I want in the world, but I can't find anybody that knows security. So security architecture is probably your biggest demand, shortest supply out there, and most critical shortage of all the technology architectures out there. And if we look at the AI side of it, and if we look at the enterprise side, it's actually, if we look at what happened when all these organizations went to the cloud and made horrible business decisions, and 80 to 90% of them got nothing for it. Nothing for it. They wasted money effectively, which could have been spent to give employees raises, to lower their prices for their customers, to invest in something else that would be good for the business. And what's the fix for that? Enterprise architects that align people, processes, and technology, and now AI. So that's why they're my two favorite. I can't tell you which one I love more because I've done both. And part of me, has been a martial artist, a protector my whole life, a medical provider my whole life, and that's what drives me to security. And I did that for a while, and I loved it, Jeremiah. But when it came to wanting to get a job that I was able to actually retire at 34 years old, I got that from enterprise architecture. So kind of hope that helps, because I understand all the knobs you were actually asking there, but they're all great jobs, and I recommend any of them. Tyron, bring in the next one. Do security architects need to craft a business case? So Tommy, do you think you can would you just spend $50 million on security without knowing what your risks are and what you're protecting and how that $50 million is going to cost less than your actual risk? He would never give me the $50 million, neither would anyone else. So, do you have to create a business case? The answer is yes. What are the steps of the formula? Well, in order to create a business case, it takes training. And we spend about 1,000 hours training our architects to do these kind of things. So you could train with us. If you are not training with us, I recommend getting a master's in business administration, because there's going to be elements from all those courses, accounting, finance, business, that are all going to be necessary to create a business case. Maybe one day I can do a live stream on it, but it's not something I can do in a couple minute box. But it all involves is looking at what your typical risk is, quantifying that risk, and being able to show that your risk mitigation plan will address sufficient of those risks and cost less than the risk itself. So that's going to be at the high level what we do. But to go into any depth, we'd need 100 hours or so just on business cases. But even if we just focused 100 hours on a business case, you still need to learn a lot of that other stuff, which you would then need to put into the business case. So it's not something that you can just learn by itself. It's a great question, though. How long does it take to create a statement of work? Depends on it. Could take days. And if you need input from a couple people, it could take you weeks. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be on it all day, but you won't. But you might do one thing. You create a section, and then you realize that you need input from a program manager and 3 engineers about one thing. You send that thing out while you send that out to 3 other people. You get 2 back, but not 1. So then you got to go to that team, figure out what the holdup is, kind of work with them, do some smoozing to get that thing done. So generally speaking, it could take a couple of weeks. Just like an RFP response. I had one RFP response that took about 60 days to respond to. Good question. Tyron, bring in the next one. What's the difference in the approaches between a consultant versus an architect when talking with clients? Nothing. So when we talk about consultant, we have to be fair what a consultant actually is. And I'm not talking about the term consulting, which means lack of steady work. And I'm not talking about consultant meaning somebody that's not an employee, that's paid as a consultant, which generally speaking doesn't make sense for architects, even though it's possible you'll usually earn more money in another way. But so generally speaking, if you were to say what a consultant at McKinsey does, a consultant at Deloitte, a consultant at Accenture, a consultant at KPMG, Capgemini, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Barclays Bank, a tech strategy company like IBM or Cisco, a consultant is coming in. They're looking at where the business's goals are. They're looking at various elements of the business, people, processes, technology, AI, and they're going to be looking on it. So I actually learned most of my architecture skills by studying consulting. And learning consulting really helped. I took lots of courses in consulting, and I worked as a strategy consultant along the way. And Tommy J, that's what took me from a security architect and into a senior enterprise architect, and then a chief architect role. It was the consulting skills, how to approach the client, how to identify the stakeholders, how to map out the business capabilities, business architecture, anything from a function process model to a capability map to a value stream, what have you. Those kind of things really helped. Now, in consulting, I learned a lot about communicating with executives and CXO relevancy, and that helped me a lot. It gave me a structured approach to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In fact, most consulting companies have their own frameworks, kind of like TOGAF, which is a framework. Most companies have their own framework. So there's much more of that. So in any consulting role, you're delivering presentations. In any consulting role, you're selling consulting services, assuming it's a senior enough role like an architect role. In any consulting role, you're getting information from a lot of people. In any consulting role, you're taking that information, you're drawing insights out of it, and you're presenting those insights to the client. In any consulting or architect role, you're making recommendations that you need to influence the client to do to fix their business. They are very, very, very similar roles. In fact, when people say, Mike, I want to be an enterprise architect, what's your approach? I'm like, either take a course like ours or go to business school, get a job as a management and strategy consulting, and then learn technology after that. Because it is so much like strategy consulting, management consulting. And I'll tell you, before I learned consulting and after I learned consulting, there was about a 6-figure difference in my salary. That's how much of a difference it makes sense. Akimi, if you're in security experience, how to move to security architecture, you're going to have to learn those security architect skills. I think we have a security architect webinar on. It's on Friday this week. Is that correct? For my team? Okay, yes. So on Friday, we're going to have a How to Become a Security Architect webinar. There's no link, but if you sign up for the Enterprise Architect thing that we have today, we'll invite you to the one on Friday. And feel free to join us in the Enterprise Architect course tonight. The key to remember is what we do as architects is we design a strategy. And if we look through the strategy that we're typically doing, it's going to have a lot that's going to be involved in understanding the organization's needs, and being able to create a program for them. So if we look at if we actually look at what goes into designing a strategy, I'll kind of give you a perspective. We can map it out. These are good questions. So if we start out here, and let's say we approach a client, or the client brings us in. Let's say we take the first client meeting. So we take the client meeting, and the client comes to us. We need help protecting X, Y, Z, what have you. So the first thing is we have a client meeting. And what do we do in this first meeting? Well, we have a couple things. We have to determine what the goals are. Because if we don't know what problems we're trying to solve and what our success is, we have no idea for what we're designing. So the first one is determining the goal. After we determine the goal, we need to understand the scope. For example, did they bring us in to create a strategy for just their AI security, or do they want us to create a new strategy for their entire organization? So we have to figure out the goals, the scope. We have to identify stakeholders. So let's say we've got a global organization. Obviously, our work will affect the entire organization. So that means we need to think about how our work will affect various components of the C-suite, people that run various business units, people that are running the IT department or the security department. So lots and lots of meetings we identify here. So then when we get to this next phase, what we're doing is a couple things. We're identifying, we're speaking with stakeholders, and we're getting the stakeholders' input and guides of what they're trying to achieve, where they see their challenges are, where they see their payments, what have you. We're identifying assets. To determine what we're trying to protect, because you don't spend $1 billion to protect a $50,000 thing. We identify the assets, the assets value, the risk to those assets. So then we figure out what we're dealing with. Now, the goal here by the end of this phase is to be able to, realistically speaking, know what the risks are. So I know what our risks are. We've quantified the risk. We've quantified the weaknesses in the system. And now we need to do something about it. So at this point, after we know how the business runs, we know what the assets are, we know what the vulnerabilities are. Typically speaking, we've got to create our architecture team. And I type faster than my accuracy, clearly. So we create our security architecture team, and what's going to be on it? We may have some IAM people, for example, and network security is going to be a different kind of security. So we're going to have some network security. We're probably going to have some application security people on our team, for example. We may need some members of compute on our team. So we may need some infrastructure architects here, like compute storage. We're probably going to have some AI architects, because we're going to have some AI. So we're going to typically be creating a team, and we're going to have to ultimately lead that team. Now, once we have this team, which we created, I'm going to create some more space. I think we're going to need it. And we have all this. What are we doing in here? What's the output? So the output here should be a proposed design, like a proposed architecture of what we want to achieve. And then we take this proposed architecture and we go back to the stakeholders with it, and we say, how do you feel about it? And then we get stakeholder feedback. Now, after we have this stakeholder feedback, we integrate the feedback, typically speaking, we go back to them. And when we finally have a yes from the proposed architectures, then we get involved in the other part of our job. So we're going to have to create all the architectural contracts. So there might be some RFPs along the way. There might be some statements of work. There might be an implementation plan. Now, obviously, you'll get help from program managers and project managers for some of those. There'll be a statement of plan. There'll be some governance information, etc. And that's realistically the process. We'll get this. We'll have to create this document, sell it to the C-suite, sell it to the board, get funding, and then we turn it over to the engineering team to build it. So that's kind of what we're doing. And in that governance phase, we could be building incident response procedures or playbooks or something like that. So kind of hope that helps. Hello, sir. How can a technical cybersecurity analyst quickly adapt once appointed to managerial position, e.g. cybersecurity manager? So here's a question. Let's say you're a flight attendant and somebody says, well, you're the airplane pilot now. Would you know how to fly the plane? And the answer is no. So let's say you're at a company like Cisco, Palo Alto, Fortinet, Checkpoint, and you want to move into management. What do? You go to your manager and you say, you know what? I would really like to move into a managerial position. How would you feel about that? And you listen. And the person, for example, may ask questions like, so you might, would I be able to, do you think I have any gaps that I need to learn along the way? And I promise you, if you're not in a management position, your manager will say yes. And they will probably tell you your gaps. Typical gaps include leadership skills, managerial actual knowledge of the things that you need to manage, typically some executive skills, some executive communication, because you're going to have to communicate to executives to be able to defend and support your team. So typically, what do? They recommend that you get some training because they know that you can't go from doer to manager without it. They could recommend an MBA. They could recommend some managerial training. In many cases, they'll pay for managerial training. But if you get appointed to a managerial position, and I've seen it without management training, I can tell you what happens. About 50% of the time, the people are fired within 6 months. Because now you've got someone that knows how to be an analyst, and all of a sudden they're a manager, but they have no idea how to be a manager. In fact, Arnold, when I started, it used to happen all the time. They used to promote the best engineers to management, and they had no idea how to manage. So what used to happen is as soon as an engineer became a manager, the rest of the team quit because they needed a real manager that could actually manage them and protect them, not an engineer. And then the person would get fired, and then it would be a cycle again and again. And I've seen it again and again. So if you got put into a leadership role, get a crash course in leadership and management, something that's mentored by people with management skills. You can go in there and say, today I had a challenge in this situation. Tomorrow I have to have a difficult conversation with an underperforming employee. The day after that, I have to have a conversation with someone that's a great person, but they are horrible for my team. So I want to find them a new job in the company. So what are the skills? How do I sell that to someone else? Because they've got good capabilities, just not the ones I need in my team, but they'll be successful in somewhere else. How do you build that team? How do you keep that team energetic? How do you resolve problems? So that's the stuff you need. So what did I do when I went into leadership? I got an MBA and got leadership training. So I don't believe in flying the plane unless you can protect everybody in the back of the plane. I never injected a joint like a subdeltoid bursal injection before I actually knew enough of how to do it, where the shoulder was, and was licensed and allowed to do it. So for me, it's always get the skills and then go there and why. So you got two options. You go from a regular role to an individual contributor role to a manager role. You've got the training. You do a good job in that first 90 days in your managerial role. The team's doing good. The team's loving you. The team's doing things. You see that your management sees that in the next year, you're a senior manager. 2 years later, you're a director. And 2 years later, you're a VP. Or you get in that role and you flounder because you don't know where to go and it gets a little bit involved. So when we actually start looking in those kinds of things where you don't know where to go and you fumble, you don't typically have that managerial trajectory. So if you're lucky enough to get promoted into management, get the skills as fast as you can, because, you know, it'll be a huge difference in your career. Just a huge difference. Have to be able to do the job that you have. Otherwise, we don't keep them long. And you can see on a modern resume, in most cases, who's not good at their job, because they'll be somewhere for 6 months and then 9 months and 9 months and 9 months. Now, I'm not saying during major epidemics, people don't lose a job. But I'm seeing that short burst at 6 different jobs in like 4 or 5 years. That's what managers tend to run away from, because we figure the person doesn't have the skill for the job, and that's why they keep making it. Now, if somebody is 1 year here as a solutions architect, and they went to a principal solutions architect at an equal size company, and then they go to a distinguished architect, and then they go to a chief architect somewhere else, that looks fine, because it's an upward mobility. You did such a good job, you got promoted. But hope that helps. Join us on one of the free webinars where we can actually speak face to face. I think it'll be helpful. Dingelman, good to see you, Dingelman. I know you've been doing well. Hi, Mike. When working on a longer term project, what's the best way to demonstrate small wins along the way? So typically speaking, when I'm on a longer term project, there's going to be phases of that project. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, phase whatever. Typically speaking, when we get to one phase and the first phase is done, I typically come up with some kind of celebration. Typically make sure I take everybody out, give them some fun, do some team building events, typically write letters to their management, letting them know what a good job they did on this phase and that you're excited for their support on the next phases. And I always go to the people's management that are part of my team, so their management knows they're doing a good job. Because if someone does a good job for you, and they might not be doing the work that would be part of their team otherwise, you need to help them get promoted because they're doing a good job. So there is that. Generally speaking, with every major milestone, assuming you and the team. Okay, so let's say in the beginning of an architecture, you've got your architecture team. You say you're the lead security architect, and I think that's where you're at, Dingelman, because we trained you. And I know you had one job in engineering, and I know you're working as a security architect, so you've got to win. You know, you might manage that to the key stakeholders in there. We've completed phase 1. Phase 1 included X, Y, Z steps. We completed it 3 days earlier than expected at a reduced budget than expected, or whatever it is that you can do. This is a credit to all of the team. Some special players that did X, Y, Z are here. Now, that way, the people see that the executive leadership are there. They're more motivated to work for you. They fight harder for you and your team. And guess what? They get promoted and higher salaries in better places later, because you went and showed the senior leadership how good they were, got them the visibility they needed, and put them on a high prestige project. So that's kind of a lot of what we're actually talking about, what we're doing. And that's how, generally speaking, I do it. Sometimes if it's feasible and your company has what's called cap awards, or the ability for you to use company money to give small little bonuses, sometimes you might want to do that too, especially for some key players. Great question, Dingelman. Security assurance to security architecture. So could you tell me what you mean by security assurance? Because security assurance could be multiple things to a lot of people. So tell me what you mean by security assurance. What you're actually doing. Because assurance in security also has another term. Because I have a feeling we're not talking about the same security assurance. That's why. M. Haji. So can architects use their skills to become a consultant? Does the market exist? More 1099 work or more W-2? So I know many enterprise architects that do consulting things. But any good enterprise architect that I know is not doing a consulting thing, because I know plenty of architects that earn $500,000 to $1 million a year at one job for being great. And I know very consultants that can actually do that. So the question becomes, is if you can move yourself into a $600,000 or $700,000 chief architect role, and with that, you can get a large number of restricted stock units, 30 days paid vacation per year, all your insurances, why would you want to do consulting things on the side? Now, the other thing that I would like you to think of is, and I really want you to understand this. So let's say JP Morgan Chase wants to do something. Wells Fargo wants to do something, and notice they're not having any problems because clearly they wouldn't put themselves on a single cloud like that. But and they have their data centers and other things. So let's just say, for example, you have the opportunity to take a bunch of small paying consulting things or one big job. You take the big job. You get your restricted stock units. You get in the press. Now, I want you to also think about this. Now, I'm the chief information officer of, say, JP Morgan Chase Bank. And you want to sell me consulting services. Most likely you will get laughed out of the door, and here's the reason why, and it has nothing to do with how good you are. So I'm now the CIO of a bank, and now I need an architecture firm to come in. And IBM comes in, or Cisco comes in, or Microsoft comes in, or Accenture, or Deloitte. One of the best known strategy consulting companies in the world comes in, and they say, do this. We recommend this. And I do it, and it fails. Guess what? I went to Accenture, and they recommended it. And Cisco also recommended it at the same time. Well, Mr. Haji, you and everybody else would have done the same thing. You followed the recommendations of the best in the world. Now, all of a sudden, I'm the CEO, and Cindy, the cybersecurity cat, comes in, and I give it to Cindy. And Cindy's smart. But something happens, because things always happen. Now, I instantly got fired because I used Cindy, the cybersecurity cat, and I didn't use an industrial provider. So could you do it? Yes. If you want to start a consulting business, make sure you've got a lot of money for marketing, because the banks aren't going to call you. They're not going to know you unless you spend a couple of $1 million in marketing. You're also going to have a very good sales staff to be able to take the phones and sell it. So all in all, you could do it, but you could do anything if you wanted. But generally speaking, CEO types and executive types and people that have this kind of opportunity to earn real money, generally speaking, they're not trying to do a bunch of part-time jobs. You don't have to, because you can earn more money than the 1099 consultants and per hour as a full-timer, and you're going to get benefits. So generally speaking, people don't do that. You could. I do know people that have done it. But the people that I know that have worked for other organizations are typically much more successful. They're typically much wealthier over the term. But you could. We make sure all projects are compliant with ISO 27000 NIST and other things. So, okay, that is the same insurance that I thought you were actually talking about, but I just wanted to be sure. So what you actually have to learn is the rest of the domains. So, but you might actually know them. I'm actually going to say this. Can you come to our webinar tonight at 7 p.m.? I know it's for enterprise architecture. What I'd like to do is interview you, because you might actually have a fair number of those skills working in that kind of assurance where you're looking at compliance and frameworks, especially depending upon the number of stakeholders that you have. So what I want to do is I want to check your cybersecurity knowledge. And I can do it tonight, even if it's not Friday. I'm happy to do it tonight. And if you're somewhere, say, in the Middle East, and you want to do a different day, we're probably better on the Friday one that we're going to do. But no matter what, depending upon where you're at, I'd like to interview you. I'd like to ask you 4 or 5 questions on one of these architecture webinars. I'd like to see how you respond to them, because it sounds like you've got a good education. I want to assess your executive presence. I want to assess your cybersecurity thinking. Can you see the big picture? Or are you focused on the one thing that you know? And there I can give you a real recommendation, because you've got a master's in business. You might have 3/4 of the skills already, or you went to school and they didn't teach you how to apply it, and we'll assess that. So if you can come good, because the key is, what I would say normally is you've got to learn all the other things, but maybe you didn't. maybe you're giving presentations to executives. Maybe you're influencing the C-suite and the board. Maybe you know how to build a budget and get a budget approved. Maybe you know risk management. Because if not, you're going to have to learn a very different set of skills. But I need to baseline you because you're outside the ordinary. And then you've got some kind of master's degree in business, but it's a master's in science versus a non-science. So I really want a little bit more to assess you. So that's my recommendation. And you're in the UK, so that'll be at midnight tonight, but it won't be on Friday. Chris or Tyrone, if you're behind the scenes, if you can put the time that it will actually be on Friday into the chat box, because 7 p.m. is midnight in the UK, which might be a little late, or of course you could do it, or if it's not this one, I know the one on Friday will be a better time, because you might be in a better situation than the average person coming from engineering. And if you are, I can give you specific guides, and if not, I can tell you exactly what you need to do. You have 12 years experience in customer and care, have a background in electrical, engineering, cybersecurity, and cloud computing, respectively. Where do I start and blend all these together? So what do you want to do? I don't care what you've done for the last 20 years because I care what you want to do tomorrow. And this is something that most people don't realize. What you used to do has no bearing in who you are today. I had one student that had a criminal background, and now he's working as an enterprise architect, and he's doing just great. I'm a medical professional. I spent the first third of my life in medicine, first half of my life in internal medicine. Next thing I know, I am a principal network architect 2 years later. So the question is really, what do you want to do? Because what you've done in the past, electrical engineering, so much of that is done by AI right now. What have you done in cloud computing? Have you designed a strategy? Have you been designing strategies to protecting people? Have you been configuring firewalls? Have you been configuring IAM systems? What have you done? And what would you like to do? What have you done in cloud computing? Seriously, what have you done in cloud computing? Have you designed multi-cloud architectures like the other 98% of the organizations, or have you touched something? Have you set something up in cloud computing? So if we want to look at where you've been, then we need a really good asset of your skills. For a comparison, if we want to look at where you're going, then we need to look at all the skills that you'll need, and then we can go back and look at the ones you actually possess. For example, I was a firefighter paramedic, which is how I paid my way through college. Now, that wouldn't make me a nurse. I still had to go to school for 4 years to become a nurse, but it made it easier. For example, I knew how to start an IV. I knew how to do an EKG on a patient. I knew how to draw blood from a patient, which was the silliest part of our job. It was all the things. I knew how to administer IV medications. I knew how to do an endotracheal intubation. So it made nursing school easier, but I still needed the same 4 years because 98% of it was different. Then I learned internal medicine. I'm an NP. Now, I got to tell you, I learned a lot of stuff as a nurse that helped me 2%, but medicine and nursing were two completely different things. So I went back to school and learned a completely different set of skill. Did that time as a nurse give me maybe 5%? Yeah. Did my time as a paramedic maybe give me 15% of what I needed? Yeah. But I still had to learn the other 80%. So that's the key. So we have to figure out what you've actually done in electrical engineering. For example, you're calculating single attenuation on a wire that's going and determining what kind of wires can carry what kind of signals, or are you designing something related to what goes inside of a TV? Because each and every one of these things could be different as it was pertained. So the question is, where do you want to go? Not what have you done? What have you done? It's just what you've already done. Let's say you're out of shape and you wanted to get in shape. Do I care that you used to be out of shape? No way. I'm going to connect you with a great strength and conditioning specialist. We're going to get a diet and exercise program for you, a mobility program, an energy systems development program, a strength, speed, power, agility, mobility program. And guess what? You're going to be awesome. So it's not what you used to do. It's what you actually want to be. Hope that helps. Okay, bring in the next question from my team. Do I have a network architecture webinar? I do not. I definitely loved all the time I spent in networking. But as it stands right now, and it could change, especially with a lot of the cloud repatriations back to the data centers and things that we're thinking, where I actually focus my time on architectures right now are in the biggest, most in-demand, most critical shortages. And what I mean by that, the biggest shortage right now is probably security architecture. So I focus on that. So there's a massive shortage in AI. I believe that's more of a transient shortage, but there's a massive shortage, so we train it. Most businesses spend a ton of money on technology and get nothing for it, which is why the enterprise architect is considered the king and queen of all architects, because it's at the top. Doesn't make it better, but it's at the top. So I cover that. So they're the only ones I'm doing now. I might consider doing networking in the future, and I might actually consider a webinar about it as well. But for right now, we are focused on all the places where the jobs exist and none of the places where the jobs are on a tighter market per se. But I'm still thinking about it. If there's a lot more cloud repatriation that goes on, I might actually come back with a network architecture thing. But I can definitely do some network architecture things live stream if you would like, because network architecture is near and dear to my heart. And if you've got a desire to become a network architect, come to any of my other architecture webinars. I will assess where you're at and I will make recommendations. So I definitely assessed a lot of network architects in my life, more than I can count. Okay, so you've done cloud security. So Del, does that mean when you were configuring security systems, you were using the cloud native stuff like in an AWS certification? Or in the real world, for example, you were configuring firewalls, say from Palo Alto, Cisco, Fortinet, or Checkpoint, and you were working on SIEM systems, industrial SIEM systems, not from the actual cloud provider. And you were working with real endpoint detection and response systems and more SAR systems and more context-aware IAM, for example, and setting those up and working with the integration points of cloud access security brokers. So if you've done that, you've done some real cloud security engineering. If you've done what's like in an AWS certification where you added Macie and ACL and a firewall, honestly, we'd have to start you from ground zero and seriously teach you some serious security. So the question really becomes on what you've done, because if you've taken like a vendor thing, you've learned how to be biased towards a certain set of products, which might actually be worse for you than if you didn't learn it in the first place. Because I don't want you to prefer Cisco over Palo Alto. Why? I need you to be a trusted advisor like a doctor. The doctor can't prefer a Pfizer medication to a Merck medication. The only thing the doctor can actually afford to do is make their patients better. The only thing a true consultant can create a great strategy for an organization. Plus, the other reason I don't like any of these single vendor cloud native things is they don't work multi-cloud. And 98% of organizations that are going to hire you are multi-cloud. So I'd love to know more what you mean by this. So, and I'd really like to know what more you did on cloud security engineering. Maybe I can see you tonight. Come to the webinar and I'll assess you to try and ask you the questions of what do you mean by this in a real-time conversation live on YouTube. Or I'm happy to do on Friday on the Security Architect one. But that's going to take a conversation for me to really ask questions live in real time. And I'd be happy to do it. So I have had a great time answering questions. I'd like to answer more, but unfortunately I did run out of time. But from 5 to 7, I'm going to be discussing security architect careers. Everything you need, you will know. So by the end of that architecture webinar tonight on enterprise architect, you will know exactly the skills you will need. 100%. You will know where we use these skills. You will know how to stand out. You will know how to get people to come to you and how to win the interview. It's free. It's live on Zoom, so we can really speak face to face. I wanted to remind everybody that the following: after the free architecture webinar tonight, we have a free cybersecurity fundamentals bootcamp, 5 4-hour days live and free on Zoom. Tell your friends, come to any of these things, and it is free, so join us. And for those of you that want that are intent, real architecture training programs for the full career, they're all about 1,000 hours in length. And you stay with us until you're hired in the main components of the program. Well, you can have 50% off of all of those now. And these are seriously heavy-duty, life-changing programs. So, if you want to take advantage of that, great. So if you had a good time today, maybe give it a like, maybe forward this video to others, or subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to be notified of new videos. And I'll see you soon. Take care if you've got any questions, everyone. And I can't wait to see you. Hopefully free tonight. Bye, everyone.